Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, my name's Izzy and I collect cool to hot growing orchids here in my apartment in Sydney. Today I'd love to give you my recommendations for my top 5 best beginner orchids. So the orchids that I've chosen to make up my top 5 list are ones that are in my own collection, so I've had experience growing them for the past 2 or 3 years or so. While I've been a beginner, I'm still an amateur orchid grower. I'm by no means an expert or anything like that. It's still a bit of trial and error along the way, but the ones that I've selected I've found to be the most vigorous growers with really good vigorous roots that aren't just hopefully going to die on you spontaneously, and ones that are also quite reliable bloomers as well. So they flower each year or sometimes a couple of times a year, which is also something that you want if you're a beginner. You want to have rewards for all the work that you're putting into growing your orchids and making sure they're nice and healthy. If you are super new to orchids as well, maybe you've never grown them and you're interested in getting into growing them, or perhaps you've just got a couple of store-bought or supermarket Phalaenopsis orchids. One of the first most important things to know is they're quite different from a standard houseplant. About 70% of orchids are epiphytic or epiphytes, which basically means they like to grow on the sides of trees or on the sides of rocks and things without any soil or potting medium around them, as opposed to a terrestrial plant that grows in the ground. And that quite profoundly impacts the way that you'll care for them, their watering, and what you pot them in. It also is just really going to depend on your own home environment or where you'd like to grow your orchids. If you prefer to have some that grow outside and you don't have them in your house or in your apartment, or if you would prefer to have some just inside. There's lots of different factors that go into which orchids will grow best for you and flower best for you. So if you find an orchid that you're really interested in, perhaps it's one that I'm about to list, or perhaps it's one that you've seen online or something that you really like, always just do a little bit of extra research to make sure that you can grow it in your own growing conditions. And sometimes things will grow better for you than they do for me, or they might grow better for me than they do for you. So it just really depends on the whole situation. So the first orchid that I have on my list, or group of orchids, are hybrid Sarcochilus orchids. The reason I have listed this as a hybrid Sarcochilus as opposed to species Sarcochilus, which are the ones that you'd find in the wild or as they would grow in nature, is I find hybrids to be a little bit hardier, a little bit easier to care for, and a bit more of a vigorous growing orchid than some of the species sarcs. So they're really good to start with to get basic care down pat before you then move on to getting some species ones. So these sarcs that I have in my collection are the Burrito orchids Burrito orchids Culnara hybrids. Their growth habit all looks quite similar, but the flowers are quite different. All a similar size flower, but a range of colours, patterns. Some of them are scented, some of them aren't, so you can really go wild with getting whatever takes your fancy. I've got quite a lot of these that are living outside at the moment. I've just brought one inside to show you, and I'll insert some clips and some photos of what the flowers look like so you can get a bit of an idea. They generally start to develop their flower spikes throughout winter, and they'll start to open in spring. So none of them are in flower at the moment. It's just the start of autumn here in Australia. So they've really just sort of finished their vigorous growth season, which is summer. This one, you can see it's got quite a nice little root tip here with a green tip, so it's still an activated growing root. And you can see they also are monopodial like Phalaenopsis orchids, so they grow from one stem, but these guys are quite notorious for producing kikis. A kiki is basically the Hawaiian word for baby, which basically means a baby plant that's growing out. So you can see this pot looks quite full of kikis, which I don't mind. Some people, I'm sure, don't really like kikis, and it also depends on the orchid. But in terms of Sarcochilus orchids, I think kikis are great because it means you'll get multiple flower spikes, the plant will get bigger and fuller, and it will look more and more impressive each year. So if you're looking for something that grows really well outside and you can just pop it outside and it doesn't require too much care, sarcs are fantastic. I wouldn't really recommend growing them inside. They do really need quite a significant cool down period throughout the winter to initiate flower spikes. So I'm sure you could try growing them inside. I just don't know how well they would do. They're also cool to intermediate growers. So they generally like temperatures overnight of about 10 degrees Celsius. In the cooler months, not sort of year round, but in the cooler months, 10 degrees Celsius up to about 30 degrees Celsius during the day. So cool to intermediate generally. Another bonus is they have really beautiful colourful flowers. They are quite small and dainty flowers, so if you're a fan of that, then this orchid type is definitely for you. And in terms of watering, I generally water these ones when the medium has dried out. So in summer on the really hot days, I probably would be watering them almost every day or every second day, and then it slows down to once or twice a week in the autumn, and then maybe once a week sometimes, if that, in the winter. But generally speaking, just make sure the medium has dried out and it's in a free draining mix. So this one's in a mixture of chunky bark, perlite, and some lava rock pieces as well. Don't know if you can see that, some lava rock pieces. So yeah, really free draining, allows it not to be too waterlogged because the roots won't like that. As I mentioned, you can get these particular types from Burrito Orchids, which is an orchid nursery in New South Wales. They also do have an online shop and they ship throughout Australia as well. And then I'm sure you'll come across them at orchid shows, particularly in the spring when they're in flower. Most things are generally sold at shows when they're in bloom to make them more attractive, and so that you know what you're purchasing as well. The next group of orchids that I've got on my list, the overarching heading would be Oncidium type orchids, but there's two specifically that I would like to mention. The first one is Oncidium Acababy, or aka Baby, Acababy Raspberry Chocolate, which is this big one here. This one, look, I will just preface this by saying currently the bulbs are a little bit shriveled. That's because I have been quite busy lately and haven't been watering this one quite as much as it probably needed. It did just finish flowering a month or so ago, which is the time generally that they need the most care and love, and I have neglected it a tiny bit. But needless to say, this is why it's on my list of best beginner orchids, because this orchid hybrid is so vigorous and so forgiving that you should be fine even if this happens. So yes, wrinkling on the bulbs, that's generally a sign of dehydration. It has got some new growths as well, but this has just grown immensely since I first got it from an orchid show. This was one of the, if not the, actually the very first Oncidium type orchid that I actually got from an orchid show a couple of years ago. And I was so intrigued by it because its name, Raspberry Chocolate, is what it's scented like. Now, mind you, I don't find the scent to be exactly like raspberry chocolate. I've definitely got some other orchids that smell more like chocolate than this one, but it is a beautiful sweet perfume. This one is a hybrid of Oncidium Shari Baby and Oncidium Jimbo. Jimbo? Let me check. Yeah, Oncidium Jimbo, which I don't really know too much about, but if you look them up, you'll see how it resembles it. But this is definitely an orchid if you want something that's a little bit larger, a little bit more impressive. This also has huge flower spikes when it gets big. When I measured this one when it had its flower spike, it was 90 centimeters long. So nearly a meter long flower spike. So Oncidium type orchids will flower off their new growth that is recently matured. So as a general rule of thumb, Oncidium orchids flower in spring or autumn or both, but most of the time it's basically just once they've got a new growth and it's newly matured, generally they should be able to produce a flower spike. So really it can happen any time of the year. I keep this one indoors year round, but you can put some Oncidium orchids outside depending on your conditions. This one I believe is a cool to intermediate grower, so I'm sure it will be happy outside. I just generally keep it inside now. It's easier in my apartment. There's other orchids that need to be outside, so I generally give them preference and then keep what I need inside otherwise. But you could, if you had a greenhouse or an undercover area outside, you can definitely pop these ones outside as well. They do like quite high light, so I do have these ones under grow lights. You probably would need to have some grow lights if you wanted this one and wanted to grow it inside. Otherwise, pop it outside, not in direct sun, but some bright indirect light, and this one would do amazingly well. Some Oncidiums as well, I find, have really fine roots that look like a bit like rice noodles, like really fine roots, so they can be a little bit finicky. This one, I've recently repotted this one as well, so you can't really see its roots, but I'll show you another one's roots in a minute. They're still fine, but they're definitely hardier than some of the other like Oncidiums behind me, like the Twinkles, that have really temperamental roots, and if you get the watering wrong, then it's detrimental. So yeah, that's why I'd say start with something a little bit bigger, a little bit hardier, like this Oncidium hybrid, and see how you go. The next one that I'd like to mention is, sorry, it's very going everywhere, is an, oh my gosh, mind the flower spike, is an Oncidium type orchid, but it is actually Miltassia Charles M. Fitch Izumi. So this one being a Miltassia, it's not really an Oncidium type, but it can be considered an Oncidium type because it does have pseudobulbs like Oncidiums. And this particular one is a hybrid of Brassia vericosa with Miltonia morelliana, if I'm correct. I'll pop some photos here for you as well. It currently has a ginormous flower spike, which is towering above my head, but it only has one, which is kind of sad at the moment. So the past couple of times it's had multiple spikes. It might grow a couple more. It's got some other growths that are maturing now, so it might get a couple more spikes, hopefully. But I love this one. It's quite long and spidery, but a really beautiful purple colour. So yeah, it's a very striking flower, which I love. And if you like really crisp, sharp edges to your flowers, you will love this one. This one also lives inside my apartment on the shelves behind me. Again, it probably could live outside depending on your environment, as long as it's under cover and you can control its watering and it gets some nice bright light, then it should grow really well. This is another one with really vigorous growth and really vigorous roots. I'll try and give you a bit of a close-up. You can see here some of the roots growing from its new growths. Yeah, like you can see the roots are quite, not fine, they're finer than like Phalaenopsis roots, but I find this hybrid to be another particularly vigorous one that I'd really recommend for beginner orchid growers. To get a handle on Oncidium type care, if you really like their flowers, then definitely go for it. But start with some sort of hybrid first, and something that has like nice big plump bulbs as opposed to something small like this one. This is Oncidium, an Oncidium Twinkle hybrid. These ones are smaller bulbs, as you can see, compared to this. Depends on what you've had experience with, so start with this, then move to this. Okay, so the next types, I feel like I have to have these on my list because it's, yeah, there's a few reasons, but just your general hybrid Phalaenopsis orchids that you can find at the supermarket, you can find at garden centres, things like that. These made it to my list for a couple of reasons. One being they're super readily available. You can find them almost anywhere. They're relatively cheap as well, so they won't break the bank, and they're really forgiving. So yeah, that's probably my three main reasons. You can also get with these a range of different colours. Some are scented. I found some that I got when I first got them from like the supermarket or something, they weren't scented, but then the first time they flowered for me, they were scented. So you never know what you're going to get. I did fairly recently do a full care video on Phalaenopsis orchids, so feel free to check that out if you want a little bit more information about how to care for them. But the main tips I'd give you are just make sure that they're in a nice free draining mix. These ones are just in some chunky bark. You can put some perlite in there if you really want to, and some scoria or lava rock. You can also put a tiny bit of sphagnum moss if you need to help maintain a little bit of extra moisture in the pot, but really some chunky bark is all you need. And just make sure that you sort of know a little bit about their watering. They are epiphytic orchids, like I mentioned at the start, and they basically tell you they need watering when their roots go silvery. They do get aerial roots like these as well, so these are silvery most of the time. You can see inside the pot, hopefully the roots are a little bit more green. These ones were only watered yesterday. So when the roots inside the pot go silvery, they need watering. Let them dry out in between waterings and then soak them or just rinse them through. And there you go. They generally flower late winter to spring, and the flowers are really long lasting. Only now, it's the very start of autumn now, the last of our Phalaenopsis flowers probably faded just a couple of weeks ago. So they do last quite a few months, and they should start growing new flower spikes in a couple of months' time. So it's sort of like half the year you'll have flowers, half the year they're growing, getting new roots, getting new leaves, and then growing spikes again. So yeah, it's just a bit of a cycle with the Phalaenopsis. Their care is relatively easy. These ones are indoor orchids unless you live somewhere a bit more tropical. Then they can be outdoors, but they just don't want to be really, really cold because yeah, they are more tropical orchids in the wild. And these ones you don't necessarily need grow lights for either. I do have them on a shelf behind me with some grow lights. The grow lights at the very top, I've probably mentioned before, they're just like little plug-in ones. They really don't do anything. I just keep them because they're kind of pretty with their color that they put on them. But you don't really need grow lights, just bright indirect light. Great for small grow spaces like apartments, or if you just want something in your house that looks a little bit pretty. And if you've got a few of them, they look really spectacular when they're all in bloom together. You can get such a variety of color, and they're just really happy looking orchids when they're flowering too. So that's another bonus. The next group of orchids, I'm going to go outside and get one for you to show you. I'll be back. Okay, so the next type of orchid that I'd like to list, another type of hybrid, but hybrid Cymbidium orchids. I feel like if you want something that can be outside, kind of set and forget type thing, give or take, these ones are really good, and they'll give you big, if you want something that has a big bloom show, these guys are for you. I'll give you a bit of a close-up. You can see slightly similar to Oncidium types. These guys have bulbs, and this one actually has a flower spike starting to grow as well. Hopefully you can see that. It's dripping all over my carpet. We won't worry about that. So yes, Cymbidiums flower winter to spring generally. So they start growing their flower spikes throughout autumn, and they do like to stay relatively moist year round. So these ones I'll show you as well. I keep them outside on my tiered orchid shelf, pretty much on the second to the bottom and the bottom shelf, which basically means whenever I water anything at the top of the shelf, it drains through and wets these guys. So I generally don't really water them specifically. They'll just get watered whenever something else gets watered, which might be daily, it might be every couple of days, that sort of thing. So they're generally pretty happy, but I do have them on the shelves so that they are able to drain freely and they're not just sitting in a pool of water at all times, because they don't want to be waterlogged, but they do want to be moist. Cymbidiums are also another one that's quite readily available. A lot of your hardware stores or garden centres will have them. I actually have a really sweet story from where I got my Cymbidium orchids. My mum actually gave them to me because my grandfather used to grow them back in the 80s. So now I've got all of his Cymbidiums, and I can see the ones that he chose and he selected, and I never met my grandpa. So it's kind of a sweet little connection that I have to him. And I can make sure that they continue to grow and thrive, and I can see what their blooms are like. I've had them for about a year now, and I've only seen one type of them bloom, so I'll show you what that one looks like. So yeah, hopefully this year we get a few more spikes. I can see what the others look like, but really these are probably the orchids that I give the most minimum care to. So great for beginners, and if you want something outside, and if you want something that has big flowers, big bloom shows that can be quite impressive. Okay, so the next and final orchid on my list, probably the largest and, well, not necessarily the largest, but the heaviest pot that I've got. This is Dendrobium speciosum. So another Australian native orchid, and this is actually a species orchid. But I just find this one to be really hardy and also quite vigorous, as you can see from the roots in the pot there. This one I've also just recently up-potted as well, because it was warping its pot that it was in before, so it was definitely time for a repot. But this orchid produces really long sprays of white, beautiful flowers, but it can come in at lots of different shapes and sizes. This is quite a large one, and this one, where did I get this one? I believe it was from Swain's Nursery, which is in Dural in New South Wales. I think they just, occasionally they have orchids and Dendrobium specifically. So yeah, we picked that one up there, and it has been amazing. It did bloom for me the first year that I had it. The year just gone, it didn't bloom, but from what I've heard, speciosums can sometimes take a year off to then put more energy into blooming the following year. So hopefully this year is the year. But in terms of growth, it's grown massively. It does really well. The main thing that you've got to remember as a beginner with Dendrobiums is they don't like to be waterlogged. So this one's in quite a rocky and charcoal mix with some lava rock and things as well in there. So yeah, it's quite rocky. They do grow on rocks in nature, and they do like their roots to dry out in between waterings. And the main thing is they also like to be have a period of drought in winter, which will then also promote flowering as well. So yes, another really amazing orchid that I would definitely recommend. But yeah, if you're a beginner, just do a little bit of research into it, have a chat to growers or wherever you purchase one from, have a chat to them, see what they recommend. And this one, I don't know if I mentioned, but I do grow it outside. I have just recently moved it to get more sunlight. It doesn't, in summer, they don't necessarily love direct sunlight, but they do like really bright light. It does get some direct sun in the morning, which is why I do have a couple of leaves that have a bit of sun damage on them. There's another one. There's another one sort of in there you can see as well. Yeah, it does have a little bit of sun damage, but the newest growth is actually doing really well because it will adapt to its conditions that it's now in. And really, you've just got to provide good air circulation. They're really flexible in terms of temperature. As far as I've heard, they can go down to 0 degrees Celsius all the way up to 45 degrees Celsius. You just do have to protect them from frost if you're in an area that has frost. Well, look, and I forgot to show you, there's a new growth coming up here as well. Hopefully you can see that. Ooh. Can you see it? Oh yes, you can see it. But I love this one. It's really spectacular when it's in bloom. And I've got so many dendrobiums now. I cannot wait for spring to come around and all of them will be in flower. So yes, I'll give you an update in spring. Alrighty, well that's everything I've got for you today, guys. I really hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you are a beginner, I would love you to pop a nice comment down below. Let me know what orchids you would like to grow or you're starting to grow. And if there's any that I just mentioned that you're interested in having in your collection, if you have any questions as well, just pop them in the comments for me. Give this video a like and please press subscribe if you would like to see more of my orchid content, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!